Tobacco Talk is a scientific study of Sot-weed. I am presenting, I'm Kaylin Beach, and we do have a guest presenter, Ronald Buddy Scott, who is a phenomenal gardener. He's a great volunteer. He's worked with us for many years, and he's also an amazing photographer. So you're going to see some of his photography throughout this presentation today. This photo is his as well. A brief introduction to us. So Piscataway Park, for those of you who are not familiar with, is a very special place. It was once the home of the Piscataway people. They are indigenous to Maryland. They view this land as sacred. It's also known as the Moyone. It was the indigenous capital and the home of the chief. We refer to it as a land full of stories. The Accokeek Foundation, also known as AF, I may refer to it by that acronym throughout the presentation, stewards 200 acres of Piscataway Park to protect and conserve the cultural heritage of this agrarian landscape in partnership with the National Park Service. Our mission here at the Accokeek Foundation is to cultivate passion for the natural and cultural heritage of Piscataway Park, and our commitment is to stewardship and sustainability. I am Kaylin Beach. I am your presenter today. I have my bachelor's in science and elementary education. I grew up here in Southern Maryland, and I began working at AF about 5.5 years ago. Fell in love very quickly with all the programs that they do, but especially enjoy my summers in the tobacco fields. Making tobacco it's such a unique and incredible experience. I'm currently a museum educator and also the volunteer coordinator. So we have a few upcoming events. I'm sure some of you have come across the Future Tobacco Talks, but we also have farm tours coming up. I believe they began last Friday, 1 and 2 p.m. These are on-site programs. We also have virtual versions for folks who can't join us on site, but we do request advanced booking and a max of 7 people for the Friday on-site tours. Our Tobacco Talks Part 3 and 4 are still to come. Next Tuesday, November 17th, we have Buyouts and Beauty Queens. And then as well, on the 24th, we have a sacred plant discussing the indigenous perspective of tobacco. So really interesting. If you haven't registered, go ahead and register for those programs. And if you register for all of them, you also get the recording from the previous program as well. All right, so most of us have encountered tobacco at some point in our lives. We tend to hear about it through the lens of the world. I'd like today to talk about tobacco through a different point of view. I'd like to look at it not for its acreage, for its amount, for its value or worth in money, but instead look at it for its beauty and its scientific genius and take a moment and appreciate the plant itself. I'd like to look at the world through the lens of tobacco. So talking specifically about how we ourselves have impacted this plant, as opposed to just focusing on how this plant has unconsciously affected our culture and our lives today. So, what's in a name? Well, that's a great question. Do any of you recognize any of these names on the screen? Yep, there's a lot of names on here. So I think we're all pretty familiar with some of the terms like tobacco, maybe tobacco. We might have even heard words like broadleaf or Indian weed or burley, weed in general. But there is one on here that really caught my eye, Sot-weed. Most of us are not familiar with the term Sot-weed. I don't know if any of you have heard it before. It's a very interesting term. Sot literally means addicted to or sought after. Weed can either be defined as a plant that is undesirable, that you don't want around, you want to destroy it, or it could also be a slang term for something that is addicting, a substance that you want more of, typically acquired from a plant. So this is a term used in the early 15th and 16th centuries on into the 18th centuries to describe tobacco. You can see it's literally named to be an addicting plant. And there was a very mixed view in the 15th and 16th centuries about, and even into the 17th century, about what this plant could do. King of England actually banned it at one point. There were a lot of questions behind that. So that just one name has so much packed into it. It's really interesting that tobacco bears so many names. Some of them come from its culture. Some of them are scientifically assigned. Some are actually slang terms. Some we don't even know the origins of. But the terms have been defined by how tobacco has been used, where it has been grown, what has been done to it to produce it. Everything has influenced those names. And over time, certain varieties of tobacco were actually classified as better based on those names. One example is Maryland tobacco. If you had Maryland attached to your tobacco type, it was automatically better than other types of tobacco grown in the regions around us, because Maryland tobacco was well known for its taste and was desired in other countries. So there's a problem with all of these names. And remember, we're looking at it from the scientific side of things today. Classification for genetic tracing is very difficult when you can't figure out what type of tobacco you are looking at, because this happens to be Bob's broadleaf as opposed to Dave's snuff, when that's really the same plant with two different names. Maryland 32 and Ohio 32 are the same type of tobacco, but they're grown in different areas and have different names as a result. So to trace the genetic history of tobacco back to its known origins in America is complicated and could even be considered almost impossible. Thankfully, it's not impossible, because we're going to do a little bit of it today. So here's the tobacco classification breakdown. You have the family, Solanaceae. This includes your tomatoes, your potatoes, your eggplants, petunias. It's the nightshade family. It's almost entirely native to North America and South America. You have Nicotiana, which is one of the 8th largest genus in the Solanaceae family and was named for Nicot, a French scientist, also where nicotine comes from. And then you have Tabacum, which is the species. This is where we'll spend a lot of our time today. Out of the varieties accepted, known to scientists, 76 of them are naturally occurring, and the majority of them are indigenous to South, North America, Australia, or Africa, in this order, meaning that South America boasts the largest number of indigenous tobacco plants compared to the rest, which is quite fascinating, really. So a brief scientific history of tobacco, and you'll see there's a little bit of overlap if you attended Kate's incredible discussion on culture and history of tobacco. There's a little bit of overlap here because scientifically those same incidences shaped tobacco as they did the culture of tobacco. So tobacco is believed to have originated in Peru, spread across America somewhere before the 1400s. We're not precisely certain. There's some debate as to when exactly it first began being grown, but it was introduced to Christopher Columbus in 1492 by the indigenous people in South America. Now in 1558, the first attempt at cultivation of tobacco in Europe fails. The African slaves arrive in the English colonies in Jamestown, Virginia, 1619. These two are very important because they not only shape the culture of North America, they also shaped the growth of tobacco. If cultivation in Europe hadn't failed, we probably wouldn't have seen tobacco grown here in North America, specifically these colonies, then states, are now states, as we do today. And if African slaves had not been brought into Jamestown and Virginia and were used in fields, we may not have seen the same hands shaping the tobacco plants as we see through the enslaved story in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries on up into what's now known as PG County, where a lot of free African Americans, after segregation and things occurred, were able to work the fields and transfer on the knowledge that they had gained to their children and grandchildren. In the 1700s, tobacco became the colony's largest export. It was sent across the globe. And like I said before, Maryland and Virginia tobacco come to be household names. You wanted Maryland and Virginia tobacco. It was the best tobacco around. Linnaeus in 1753 names tobacco after the genus, after Nicot. This is important because scientifically, this is when tobacco officially was given a scientific name. And then in 1791, you have the first link of tobacco smoking to the human body cancer side of things. And so there's a negative effect that's isolated, and this is the first scientific study to prove that there is a negative effect. This will not be the last, as we all know. And then in 1826, nicotine is first isolated within a tobacco plant. This seems sort of random, not very important, but at this time, this was very large because if you can isolate nicotine, you could potentially increase the amount of nicotine in tobacco, making it more addicting, making you able to sell more of it. All of this has an impact on the plant itself. Now we're in the 2000s, and for those of us in Maryland, we don't see tobacco grown the same way that it was in the past. Slowly it's disappearing. After the tobacco buyout, production shifts down south to North Carolina and up into Ohio a little bit. So just a very interesting brief introduction to the timeline of the scientific history of tobacco. So here I have two different types of tobacco. These are both from the Tabacum genus, but these are different varieties. So we have on your right, I believe, is Rustica tabacum. This is the first tobacco variety to be documented here in America. It's believed to have originated in Peru, and you can see it doesn't look like what we typically would think tobacco would look like today. It's also known as Aztec tobacco, and it is what traveled up and out into all of America. It was grown by the Powhatan tribe, whom Raleigh first encountered in Virginia. So it was here in Maryland, Virginia area. It is bitter tasting. It is a very strong taste to it. It was smoked for purification by the indigenous people. It is also hardy, weedy, bush-like in nature, tends to look like a shrub, as you can see from the photo. It grows very well with other plants. It grows to be about 4 to 6 feet tall. It's drought tolerant, and it requires very little care. So you can see it's very different from what we tend to see tobacco today. Again, it was also used medicinally to heal wasp and bee stings, toothaches, and other things by indigenous peoples. On the other side, you have Nicotiana tabacum, which is a more hybridized variety. It is a mix of multiple small varieties of tabacum. So it's a Spanish tobacco mix. It was done by the Spanish. This variety is also indigenous to America. It, in comparison to Rustica, is mild. It's sweeter tasting. It's a very stocky plant. As you can see, it gets very tall, grows to be over 6 feet, and its flavor can vary based on how it is cured. And it was preferred by the Europeans for all of these things. The Virginia variety was known as the sweet scented, or Virginia tobacco, or even sweet tobacco. Maryland variety was known as Orinoco. This eventually becomes Maryland type 32, and it has a stronger flavor than Virginia's sweet tobacco. It was grown in Maryland and Virginia by the early colonists, and it quickly gained popularity on the Old World market and held that popularity for a great deal of time. So I mentioned before, both of these plants are actually related. This very incomplete diagram was put together to demonstrate just the connections we have between these two plants. So you can see Nicotiana tabacum is actually a child of Nicotiana sylvestris, which is wild. Interestingly enough, also grown in the Victorian era as an ornamental, beautiful, beautiful plant. Then you have that connects to Nicotiana rustica, which was the indigenous tobacco that we saw here in Virginia. That connects back to Nightiana and Paniculata, and I'm sorry, some of these scientific names are a bit hard to roll off the tongue, But all of these are the original varieties that are believed to have been the first cultivated in Peru. So a really interesting little diagram here. There is a question mark there because they're not 100% sure how these three, you have N. nightiana, N. paniculata, and N. undulata. All three of them have genome structures in Nicotiana rustica. They're not 100% sure where the crossbreeding happened to get Nicotiana rustica. Do we have any questions so far? I feel like I'm going very fast and I apologize. I'm so excited to share all of this information with you. Deanna, if there are any questions in the chat, you'll have to read them out. All right, I'm just going to pull up the chat real quick. Ooh, I like the question that Marion Bond posed. Perhaps, Deanna, that's one that we could pull for our discussion time at the end. I think that would be a lot of fun to discuss. All right. So no further questions. I'm going to jump into our next bit, which actually I have a little bit of a challenge for you. So this is a game. We play it often here at the Akakik Foundation. It's a fun way to make some observations. So I have here two photos for you. Rustica tabacum, again, we just talked about this plant, and Nicotiana tabacum. You can see that the ones that Buddy took photos of is the Nicotiana tabacum, beautiful photos. Well, we're gonna play a little game. I want you to practice observation. So I notice what? So you notice something about the plant. I wonder. This noticing something makes me wonder this. And then it reminds me of this. So if you want to type that into the chat, an example for me would be I notice, and you can do this for both plants individually or you can compare them across. I notice Rustica tabacum has yellow flowers. I wonder why they're yellow. It reminds me of all of those beautiful yellow flowers like goldenrod and daffodils and sunflowers. And I know yellow can attract certain insects, so maybe it's a pollination ploy. That's a little bit more than I need, but if you want to go ahead and type that into the chat, I can't wait to see what you notice and wonder. Deanna, if you don't mind summarizing what folks are saying, just because I can't see the chat and screen share.
Sure, we're getting a few responses in now. So Marion is noticing that rustica is a frosty green like kale. So I wonder if there's any relation to kale. And Kate agrees with her, it looks darker. Heather notices a ruffly and darker appearance to the rustica. She wonders what causes it to evolve that way. Yeah, everyone's being reminded of kale and the Very Hungry Caterpillar kids book. Definitely remember that. Adrian is wondering, what the hole is. Maybe there's an insect chewing it. Angela is noticing about rustica. It appears to be a tasty treat, and she wonders for whom. It reminds her of lace. Ooh, very nice. Buddy is noticing the leaves of rustica and wondering how they were used for medicine. And it reminds me of a thorny plant.
Hmm, interesting. So many different things that we all notice. I do love the kale connection. Absolutely does look like kale, but I don't believe there's a direct relationship. Totally different family. But I mean, there's a lot of crosses over plant species, so it's entirely possible that there's something connected there. So one of the things that both of these plants have are flowers grown in clusters. One of the first things I noticed is the fact that Rustica has very tightly grown clusters, whereas Nicotiana tabacum or N. tabacum has very spread out, but still fairly clustered together flowers. Um, these flowers both open around the same time of day as well, open primarily in the dark or at dusky times. The elongated flower heads connect directly to the type of pollinators attracted. So looking again at the flowers, I wonder if you could maybe theorize what kind of pollinators might pollinate this plant.
Marion and Adrian are saying hummingbird. Shamika is saying, I think, butterflies. Heather agrees with hummingbirds as well. So does Buddy.
Yeah, so proboscis bearing moths, thinking about the time frame that they're open, dawn and dusk, and then the dark, primarily moths. Hummingbirds occasionally. There's actually a very interesting article I came across that I hopefully will share either with the further resources, or Deanna might even post it to our Facebook page, about how tobacco adjusts its times of flowering based on when it wants to pollinate and be pollinated, and when there are too many pollinators around. So it'll change from moth to hummingbird sometimes, depending on where it's located, because one of the moths that does pollinate it is also a pest for its leaves. Fun fact. So yeah, very interesting flowers. These flower bulbs hold millions of tiny seeds when ripe. Once they're fully formed, the seeds are ready. Once the seed head turns completely brown and the flower completely falls off of it. And these seeds are so tiny, you can barely make them out with your eye. They almost look like grains of salt, but they're black or brown. Rustica is much smaller than N. tabacum. We already said a lot of this. It's more shrub-like, like you said, it's a lot like kale. It seems to spread out very similarly to kale. I will say that the rustica in this picture is the smallest rustica plant I've ever seen, because it was stilted due to an insect infestation. So it's going to be a lot shorter than we're typically going to see, but again, still a very small plant. And then noticing the shape of the leaves, like you all said, rustica is very crinkly, but they're also larger leaves, whereas Nicotiana tabacum has a more slender leaf, longer, and not as crinkly, which is very interesting that they come from the same family and species, but show such different traits. So speaking of all of these really interesting things about the plant itself, I think it would be helpful for all of us to know a little bit more about how tobacco is grown and the type of work and care that must go into protecting these plants, and the types of pests and pestilences that might affect the plant's ability to grow. And I'm thankful that I have here today Buddy Scott, who's going to present his experience as a volunteer here on the foundation ground out in the tobacco fields, caring for them every day. So Buddy has worked for the federal government for 33 years. He currently works for the General Services Administration as a construction project manager, but previously has worked for the Kennelwork Park and Aquatic Gardens. And he began volunteering for the Accokeek Foundation a few years ago. Currently, he's considering his master gardener certificate, trying to pursue that. And he loves nature. If you can't tell from his photographs, he loves nature and loves to share his curiosity of the natural world with all who will listen. So I'm going to go ahead and start his presentation real quick. Let me make sure. There we go.
I'm Buddy Scott. I've born and raised in the area. I've been a big fan of the Accokeek area and the Accokeek Foundation in Piscataway Park for a long time. Let's see, my hobbies are gardening and photography. So, I was only able to volunteer for a year, but like I said, I've been a big fan, spending a lot of time at the park, hiking and fishing and doing my photography of the farm animals and the plants and the buildings. But yeah, my volunteer time was only for a year. Things happened and I was had to focus on trying to retire. uh, Harvesting, the family's done some tobacco farming, but my role in that was just been the harvesting end of it, not really what it was like during the 1770s at all. It just the modern day harvesting of it, that was it. Yeah, I got it written down here. It was a Nicotina tobacco. It was the Orinoco strain.
Yep, the
That
Orinoco.
Yeah, Orinoco. It was very it's a mild blend, but it was very popular and very profitable back then. It might still be very, it was a good smoking type of tobacco. No, I'm not exactly sure. I think that it is. I know that it's still a very popular strain, but I don't know if that's the one of the most profitable ones or not. We did 100 mounds by hand. So we had to literally till the ground and then form the mounds by hand. And of course, if they were not exactly straight or exactly spaced, we redid them. So they had to be, yeah, 100 mounds. By hand, with a hoe by hand. I mean, it was just stand there and dig the dirt and form the house with a hoe. Yeah. Uh, I think we did, I think we did probably 30 hills that one day. By the time, we got it started and we got everything started. And then when I came back, being I was a volunteer, I was only there on Sundays for about 4 hours. So they had other people doing things. So by the time I got back the next week, they gotten all the hills done. So,
Awesome.
yeah.
Yeah, making hills is a lot of work.
Oh yes, especially by hand. Especially, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it's a lot of work. Yeah. Yep. Okay. I volunteered on Sundays. It was a 4 hour block. Usually started around 9, and we would go into the field once the tobacco was planted and growing. Then we would go in and we would make sure all the weeds were gone. Hoe and clean and weed the bed. And then when they started getting taller, and we would started looking for the hornworms, then we would go in and literally physically turn every leaf over on the plant and search it for hornworms. So after weeding the beds and getting rid of the weeds and searching for the hornworms, then if it needed watering, it was watered by hand, and buckets and gourds that were used as things to dump water onto plants. Very time consuming and very tedious work. Yes. Yes, we did. As a matter of fact, I forgot about that. Yes, we did. We would definitely make sure that, we got rid of the suckers and all of that. Yeah. Yep. It's like a offshoot. The main trunk has another shoot, another branch that's coming out, and you try to remove that so that you've just got the main trunk coming out, and so that it's producing just that one trunk with the leaves on it instead of the suckers, which usually would have a lot of smaller leaves. Oh, the hornworm. Yay, the tobacco hornworm. But I did not realize that the tobacco hornworm also affects tomatoes and eggplants and peppers and other kinds of ornamentals and crops. I was introduced to the famed tobacco hornworm. So yes, it was, I didn't realize what it was, until I was explained, that it's the little caterpillar type thing with a little horn on it. So, and that, you have to literally go in, turn the leaf over, and inspect it real. I mean, they're hard to find. When they're little, they are really hard to find, and you had to go in and pick them off and basically smush them. Yeah, just take them between your fingers and squeeze them, and kill them. That was it. So, but yeah, the hornworm was really the thing that we had to worry about. It was a huge part of the day. Yeah.
Did you ever have damage on the tobacco crops from the flea beetle at all?
No.
Okay.
No.
I know that typically hits when they're seedlings, so probably would happen in the greenhouse, but occasionally you'll see a little bit of it out in the fields, depending on when you plant.
Yeah, we did have some plants that did not make it, that were seedlings that had to be replaced. So maybe that's why, but I was never told why they didn't make it, just that they had to be replaced.
Okay.
Yeah, there were seedlings that had to be replaced in the springtime. It left unchecked, they would destroy the harvest. They would just eat holes in the leaves, just like any other caterpillar. They would eat the leaves, and and that's where your profit is. The leaves are what you need. No, the hornworms, they would destroy the crop. Any crop, they would just keep eating the leaves, and they would have destroyed it. Yep, and that's where your profit is in the leaves. Probably not. Definitely not in the 18th century. Modern day tobacco, I think I would probably find another crop that's a little bit more profitable. And tobacco farming is hard. It's very hard. So no, probably not tobacco. Nope. Yes, I've smoked. I smoked for a long time. I have quit. But yes, I did smoke even when we were down there. We had some cured tobacco from the last season, and we were able to take it and mix it in with some flavorings to give a like an orange or a type, flavor to it. Let it seep and all that. So yeah, I did. I like I said, I'm a former smoker, so yeah. That's tough. I can understand the point of view because um, you can look at it and all, but it's like growing vegetables. I mean, you can have the prettiest looking tomato in the world, but if you don't taste it and eat it, then you don't know what it tastes like. And that's really hard with tobacco, because if you're not smoking it in one way or the other, then you don't know. I mean, it can be gorgeous looking, but you know, tobacco's really got a bad reputation now, so it's not something that people want to do. But I kind of agree with it. Yeah, you need to be able to. It's just like growing vegetables; you need to be able to eat them. Um, how quickly it grows and how resilient it is, even if with all of this stuff that's going on around it, it still is a gorgeous plant. I mean, the flowers are nice, the flowers are gorgeous, and collecting the seeds, and it was a lot of fun to grow.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time today to talk. And
Not a problem. I appreciate the invite to do it.
So that was Buddy Scott sharing a bit of his experience here at the farm. I'm so grateful he was able to join us tonight, and he's also around if you all have questions regarding his experience specifically with tobacco. But he did mention some very interesting things about the growth cycle of tobacco. Also, a lot of what we just talked about with the shaping of the plant, that's actually done by people as opposed to the plant's natural result. So if tobacco was allowed to grow, I imagine it would probably bush a lot more like and the rustica plant would if we didn't sucker it. So he did mention a couple pests and pestilences, and I do want to talk about those for a moment. I want to play a little game. So I have a few photos here labeled A, B, C, D, and E. And above them, I have all of these different pests and pestilences that tobacco can experience at any point during its growing season. I want to test your knowledge of these different pests and pestilences, as well as what their symptoms look like on the plant itself. Now you'll see there are a couple more options here than there are pictures to match with. That's because there are multiple options to match with certain pictures. So if you want to go ahead, open up the chat and just type in your best guess if you don't know. A lot of these, they match up with our typical descriptions of what a wilt would look like or what a rot would look like or things like that. So just take your best guess and I'll give you the answers at the end. Once we get a couple in there, do you mind reading them off?
Sure, we have 3 guesses now. I think this is stumping some people. I know it stumped me when we ran through this. I see we have guesses from Laura. She thinks it's A4, B9, C1, D3, E2. Heather would like to guess A is stem rot or black shank, question mark. B wilt, C hornworm, D aphids, E hornworm or mosaic virus. Marion is thinking 1 hornworm, 6 stem rot, 2 aphids, 4 black shank, 5 dampening off rot, and 3 thrips. And then Buddy is guessing A6, B9, C1, D2, E7. And that's all of our guesses so far.
Yeah, this was a hard one. I had a feeling we would all struggle a little bit here. And that's because we typically don't hear a lot about the different pests and pestilences that tobacco faces. But this is life or death for most tobacco farmers and for the plant tobacco itself, because these creatures, if they come in, they can eat away the entire crop. These viruses, bacterial infections, molds, they can destroy an entire crop, and it does affect tobacco itself. Certain plants actually build up resistances to some of these different plants, viruses, as well as these pests. So, A is 6, stem rot, 5, damping off rot, and 4, black shank, because all 3 of these diseases demonstrate basically a darkening of the core of the plant, and sometimes can even spread down into the roots. And if you were to chop the plant in half, essentially the center of the plant would be entirely black and molded and rotten. Damping off rot tends to occur in stem rot even in the transplant phases. So as you're taking it out of your seed beds or out of your pots and putting it into the ground into your field. And then black shank can even occur after that point and will completely turn the entire plant yellow on the outside because the nutrients can't get up the center of the stem. B, which is that lovely colorful tobacco plant, is thrips. Yeah, I didn't see that one coming at first either, but we actually dealt with those this year in our tobacco. 8, mosaic virus, and 9, your wilts. So all 3 of these, one is a pest and 2 are viruses, they tend to affect the coloring of the plant itself. So your mosaic virus literally matches what it says. It becomes a mosaic on the leaf, typically starting with small dots and spreading out till the entire leaf turns colors. And it's not a pleasant ripening and ready to harvest color. It will just turn brown in the center of the leaf and then spread outwards, and your whole leaf is toast. Your wilts tend to look like these leaves do, where they're just wilted. They fall flat to the ground. May not change color at first, but as the virus progresses, it will completely obliterate the green from your plant. It'll end up being a yellow or a brown. And then thrips are actually microscopic. They're hard to see, but they eat away the green part of the leaf itself, leaving the inner and outer, basically that center fleshy part in between the 2 skins. And that allows viruses to get in between. And thrips can actually carry different bacteria on them. So they can actually introduce an entire bacteria to your plants as they go through and eat. C is number 7, which is the budworm. Most of us don't know about this worm. Yep, there's a different one besides the hornworm. Budworms will come up from the base of the plant, tend to hang out there during the night. They climb up into the buds where the flowers are, and they completely eat the flower buds, which is a problem if you want to produce seeds. Thankfully, tobacco plants produce a lot of seeds. So they can be a problem only if they get out of control. D is number 2, which are aphids. They're a little hard to see, but typically when you have a large number of aphids on a plant, you tend to also see ladybugs and a lot of flies, because dying aphids smell like rotten meat. This can be a problem because as you attract more and more creatures to the plant itself, it affects the ecosystem of the plant, and aphids, of course, can completely eat away the stem. And then E is actually number 1, the hornworm. Yeah, I thought it'd be a little easy after Buddy did such a great job explaining hornworms to show you a picture of a hornworm. So I actually showed you pictures of the eggs that they leave behind. The moths will leave on the leaves, as well as the damage that they leave behind. They will eat an entire leaf in a day. So quite striking. There's more information on our further resources page that you'll receive in your email about these different viruses if you're curious, as well as the pests. I find them fascinating. We don't really get to talk about them too often, so hopefully you enjoy those resources. So I mentioned before that plants occasionally build up resistance to these different creatures and viruses. But one of the things that we have done to try and impact that resistance is to develop it ourselves. So, for example, in 1917, there was a new disease that was discovered, wildfire. Since then, numerous studies have been done in universities to try and track what is causing that in the tobacco plants and develop a resistance for it by inbreeding. North Carolina University did some inbreeding studies to try and reduce black shank, to isolate blue mold and black root, which is similar to the dampening off root disease. And then also University of Maryland just did a study done on the effects of pesticides in black shank resistance in St. Mary's County. So there's a lot of things that have been done by humans to try and address these different pestilences and pests. Unfortunately, they don't always take into account that some of these pests are actually helpful. For example, the hornworm. We've talked a little bit about this one already. Hornworms are actually important. You need them in your tobacco ecosystem because they eventually become the sphinx moth, which is the moth that pollinates tobacco plants. So you want them around. They feed specifically on the leaves itself of Solanaceae plants because they use the nicotine content as a protection from other predators. They're also related to the tomato hornworm, which is the hawk moth larvae. So your sphinx moth and your hawk moth are related as well. They also will pollinate petunias. And then you can see here on the other side of the screen, a smaller hornworm being attacked by this adorable little Geochorus nymph. This is a true bug. Most of us look at it and probably think of stink bugs and things like that. Geochorus will eat hornworms in their younger stages. They also eat thrips, aphids, and whiteflies, other common pests of tobacco and other agricultural crops. They're necessary. You want them in your agricultural crops because they help to suppress these different creatures. The issue is if you're using pesticides or trying to develop these resistances in the plant, sometimes you can change the plant itself and affect the ecosystem for these insects to live on. A biodiverse tobacco field is not bad. Naturally, you want all of these creatures in your tobacco field, but too much of anything can be a problem. And that's where we get into the issue. Another really interesting positive pest is the braconid wasp that actually uses the hornworm as a host. It's a parasitic wasp and it will lay its eggs inside of the hornworm. If you ever see a hornworm like this on a tomato or a tobacco plant, don't pull it off and squish it. Because what ends up happening is after these eggs are laid, the hornworm can't eat anything else. It begins to feel sick. And as the eggs grow, they eventually end up eating the hornworm from the inside out, as a parasitic animal or creature will, completely destroying the hornworm. So you actually would be doing a disservice to the wasp and saving the hornworm if you squish it. Kind of an odd thought. So we actually want some of these creatures in our fields. And I think that that's something we don't always take into consideration in the agricultural fields. It's just too easy to erase them. So talking about Maryland tobacco specifically, here's a little bit of a timeline of the different changes in the growth patterns of Maryland tobacco. So early on, before the 1600s, you have a lot of the indigenous practices. It's grown in mounds, it's cleared areas, there's small crops. Some tending involved, but it's a mild workload. There's some variety, it's mainly rustica. Its value is sacred and it's used for trade materials. And the diseases aren't very much documented. There really hasn't been a lot of conversation about that. So we don't know for sure that any of these diseases actually existed the way that they exist today, or that these pests were the issue that they are today. Some of that may have come from the larger crops that are then seen in the 18th century. It's still grown in mounds, but in cleared fields, and they're in large amounts. The workload goes up because you need to tend the crop, you need to water it. There's a lot of people involved to get rid of those hornworms and those budworms and those suckers. There's some variety, but it's primarily Orinoco here in Maryland. The value of the plant itself is inconsistent. It depends entirely on the English market. And the diseases it affects, the pests were removed by hand, and the diseases were hard to treat because they just didn't understand them. Mid-1900s, comparison. Now it's grown in rows. It's cleared fields, large crops, moderate workload. Modern inventions have lightened that a little bit, but there's still certain periods of the year you need a lot of people, such as planting and harvesting. The varieties, Some scientific modification has actually occurred genetically, just a little, but some. The value is still changing, and the disease and pests are still a big issue. There's some pesticide use, and they're also, like I said, are trying to discover resistance and isolate it so that they can do what they can to hold on to it. So here I have another very incomplete diagram of Maryland tobacco itself. And you can see that it starts with Nicotiana tabacum, also known as Orinoco, also known as Maryland 32, not to be too complicated because there are a lot of names associated with this incredible plant. But you can see that it stems off onto a variety of different Maryland types. And this is where it gets messy because a lot of these types over the years have been modified. You'll see A16, A25, and A911, which are not tobacco types. They are actually lab tobacco plants. These are those genetic modifications, strictly bred within a lab, bunches of little cells put together to create what they called a different plant. But genetically not too different because they're just bunches of genomes put together from different subtypes of tobacco. So, for example, Maryland 609. That's a big one. Most of us may have heard of it. It was first introduced in 1965, and it actually has a significant resistance to blackshank and fusarian wilt, which were two of those big diseases that I mentioned earlier. You also have Maryland 40, crossed plant. Came from Maryland 872, Maryland 201, crossed with Maryland 609. It is resistant to wildfire, tobacco mosaic virus, and highly resistant to blackshank. So you can see there's been a lot of genetic modification intentionally to try and promote resistances. It took 11 years to develop, and it actually came out in 1997 in the top 21 in a study to determine cyst nematode resistance, which is a tobacco issue as well. So it has a lot of resistances in it. Cool thing about that, a lot of those resistances come from a completely not studied variety of tobacco that's in Africa. So they were going into other countries to try and discover resistances for these diseases. So I asked you a question at the very beginning of this, and I imagine most of you probably said no. But I asked you the question, is the tobacco that we see in stores today still the same tobacco that was grown by Aztecs in Peru? And that was over 600 years ago, possibly more. Well, we've just talked a lot about all of the different ways that we as individuals have impacted tobacco, both how we grow it, why we're growing it, the genetic modifications and scientific studies that have been done to create resistances in it. But according to the studies that I've read, the genetic answer to that question actually is yes. The tobacco that we see in stores today, the real tobacco, not the synthetic stuff, but the real tobacco we see in stores today is genetically indistinguishable from the tobacco types first found in ancient Peru and grown by the indigenous people. I know this seems kind of crazy, but even with all the genetic varieties out there, in 1937, the USDA stated that tobacco from that point back through America to the original 1617 export was indistinguishable. Further studies show not only is N. tabacum indistinguishable among its varieties, the Maryland varieties, it also bears such a close resemblance to N. rustica, it is also indistinguishable genetically. Furthermore, the entire Solanaceae family is so closely related genetically that genetically, the petunia, tomato, and tobacco plants are nearly indistinguishable. Isn't that crazy? I didn't believe it at first, but there are so many studies out there that show this. These genomes show that both there's a low divergence of tobacco from its ancestors, and there's a deep connection with other Solanaceae species. So I want to take a moment and I want to discuss that. because that's kind of crazy. How is it possible that in 600 years, genetically, the world crop of tobacco is still practically indistinguishable from its ancient counterparts? And it makes me wonder, what other plants have humans tried to genetically modify over the years? And what is the difference between stewardship and dominion? So I want to take a moment and we're going to talk. You can raise your hand to comment aloud virtually through Zoom or wait to be called on, or you can type your thoughts into the chat. And I'll leave these questions up here. But I would be really curious as to your thoughts here.
All right, for question number 1, Buddy Scott says, good genes. Yes, totally makes sense. Heather says, I guess it does make sense looking at how much diversity there is in humans with so little relative genetic diversity. Yeah, I actually said the same thing. Yeah. Marion is answering number 1. She says perhaps the crop was successful as it was and nothing drove human need to improve the final product. And Buddy Scott is talking about question number 2. Corn has been modified.
Yes.
Yes, heavily modified, definitely. Also watermelon, strawberries, tomatoes. Heather is saying wheat as well. Yes. Angela is talking about question number 3, stewardship versus dominion equals nurturing versus controlling. Sure. Yes. Buddy agrees with Angela. Yes. And it looks like that's about it for the comments. And Kaylin, just give you a heads up, it is 8:01.
Yeah, so we have a couple minutes if folks have questions. I know that folks were typing things in as the program went on, and I do want to give a chance to answer just a couple questions if there are any.
Yes, there was 2 from earlier. So Marion was curious about rustica. Are there any modern medical uses found that were claimed in colonial times? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, so in colonial times, there isn't a lot of conversation about the medicinal uses of rustica. But I do know that modern medicine doesn't accept a lot of these, but homeopathically, a lot of the indigenous uses for tobacco still stand as effective uses. And maybe Miss Angela can comment. I know for a fact that it works on wasp stings. I've used it. You just chew it up a little bit, put it on like you would plantain or other wild plants, and it helps to draw out the sting itself. So I also know that other countries use it as a pesticide. They'll actually brew tobacco leaves in a mix. I don't know all of the things that go in it, but it will actually be used as a pesticide to get rid of other creatures that don't like the nicotine content of tobacco. So there are a lot of uses that we really haven't explored yet that were known to the indigenous people of South America and North America, and even other places in the world that have discovered them over the years. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can also see the chat. This PowerPoint will be made available to you all through the recording if you have questions. specifically related to the PowerPoint. Yep, plantain does work for stings. I don't know too much about sea nettles. That would be one I'd have to research a little bit. Deanna, was there another question?
There was one more question from Buddy. Is anyone growing rustica commercially, or is there any commercial use for it?
I haven't come across any commercialized rustica growing. Because most of the commercial uses for tobacco is smoking, rustica's taste isn't favored by most smokers, even though it does have that deep taste. I don't know that anyone ever really took to it, of the European settlers, the Spanish, any of them. Most of them hybridized it to make it into something that they enjoyed the taste of. So I haven't come across it sold commercially or grown commercially. I know it's still grown by individuals, particularly folks who are indigenous, because it is so integral to their culture and their traditions. Awesome. Well, it is 8:04 and I want to be honorable to your time. I thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact us directly. You can find our emails on the Accokeek Foundation website. And I hope you'll join us again for future programs, especially those upcoming tobacco talks. I'm so grateful you were able to join us, and keep an eye out for that email, because we would like your feedback about the presentation itself and thoughts for future programming. Thank you. Thanks for coming, Buddy. It was great to have you co-present with me. Thanks for sharing your experiences.
Hey, not a problem. Take care. Have a good day.
You
If you need
too.
anything, just let me know.
Of course.
Okay. Talk to you.